Good day, everyone, and welcome to NEcta 217. I'm Ron Insana from CNBC. As we've focused in the past on innovation, this year we're focusing more specifically on the customer experience, but against a background of a wildly different environment than we found ourselves in last year, both from a regulatory perspective, a political perspective, and maybe even to a lesser extent, a geopolitical perspective. Joining me now to talk about all these rather important matters, two gentlemen with whom I think I shared my very first panel here at NEcta, David Cohen, who, of course, is one of the top executives, one of the three top executives at Comcast. Michael Powell, the current head of the NCTA, which I believe is now called the Internet and Cable Television Association. And close? All right, I can actually read it. It is the Internet and Television Association. And Tom Adams, who is Executive Vice President of Field Operations at Charter Communications. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. It is good to see you two reunited after about 20 years. I think it was the very first panel. Michael, you were a commissioner. Not quite the head of the FCC at the time, but we were going way back on this. And David, I want to jump into the news right away before we kind of get into a broader conversation about the cable experience. The Washington Post is reporting that Vice President Pence offered to resign. The Dow futures are down about 450 points this morning. So I wanted to get your response to that bit of news that's out.
So this wonderful, uplifting topic to begin our discussion.
It's actually untrue. So, I just want to make sure everybody's paying attention this morning.
So. No, this is the theme here is fake news. And of course, Ron and Son is part of the NBC family, and we're one of the lead architects of fake news.
Absolutely, yes.
It is, but it's a great commentary on what we're all living through.
Yes.
In all seriousness.
Now, so a year ago,
there is nothing that Ron and Sana could have said that was sufficiently outrageous that everyone in this room might not think that really happened.
Yeah.
I mean, so that is a commentary on the times, and I actually think it's not good for news. I think it's not good for the country. And it has relatively little to do with the customer experience or the cable industry.
Well, it actually has a lot to do with the customer experience. So a year ago when we sat here, I mean, it was at least from a political perspective and even a regulatory perspective, a radically different environment. No one had envisioned what was just a few months away. Right. So before we get to the customer, I mean, if I just want to go down the line here and talk with you gentlemen a little bit about the importance of the changes that have taken place in the 12 months since we've sat down.
Right. But when we sat here last year, we talked about the presidential election, the likely victory of Hillary Clinton, and what that would mean from a regulatory perspective. And I think the unanimous sense of the panel was that we were going to continue to face challenging times, but maybe with a touch more dose of reality and fairness, as opposed to ideology and reactiveness. Obviously, we are in a very different world, but this industry continues to be one of the most intensely regulated industries in America. And with the many good things, I believe, that are happening for the industry in Washington, the shelving of the set-top box proceeding, the complete shift in the business data services proceeding, shifts around privacy, and now the current shift around net neutrality and Title II, which I want to emphasize, is only clearly a shift with respect to Title II as a source of authority. I'm not at all sure it's a shift with respect to net neutrality itself, which is a reality that our progressive friends just can't seem to get their brains around, but I think it is an accurate statement nonetheless. But I think what is interesting, and what may be most interesting and very appropriate for this convention, is that with everything that is happening in Washington, there is now a reaction at the state and local level as a perception of the Washington regulator stepping off the playing field, and therefore the need for states and localities to step in and potentially replace some of the wrong-headed regulation that has been put in place over the last decade. And so as an industry, we are now confronted with advocacy and the need for advocacy and the need for education in 50 different fora, as opposed to the primary battleground being a building or two in Washington, D.C. And I think that's that is the fate of a regulated industry. That is what we are. And so for the government relations professionals in this room, your employment is not in jeopardy. And for the legislators and regulators who are joining us, we appreciate the opportunity at this conference and through the course of the year for you to listen to our case and to listen to the reasons why an over-regulatory environment is not good for your constituents and is not good for our industry.
Michael, do you share that view? And if you do, how does it reflect back on the time that you spent at the Federal Communications Commission?
It's a good question. I absolutely share that view. It's an environment that's radically different than the one that was expected and planned for. Incumbent industries always do significantly better when you have a conservative government that takes a more market-oriented approach toward regulation in markets generally. That's generally more favorable to us. And I think what we feel privileged about is the opportunity to shift from defense, which we feel like we've been on in an intense way for 8 years, to shifting on offense. I mean, we are just as busy, but we're leading charges with real opportunities for success that are very different than before. But the one thing I would caution is the election came out different, but there are at least 3 political parties or 4 governing Washington. The kind of populism that reigns in the political establishment, particularly at the White House, should not be misread as traditional Republican, classic, reliable, free market ideology. It bounces in often funny ways, and ways that can quickly turn on industries, and particularly industries that may not be popular. And I think this is the link to your later discussion about our perception and customer service. Because what I always worry about is if you're in an industry that doesn't tend to come out well in the minds of the populist leaders often look to mine that discontent in some way that's to their advantage. You heard the president before he was elected talking about shooting AT&T Time Warner. You've heard other kinds of anti-corporate things on occasion. So we should be very, very sensitized and not be complacent about where that ideology could take you.
And so Tom, where do you stand on that? I mean, with respect to that particular point, it is one where this bouncing ball can be different day to day, minute to minute, tweet to tweet, if you will.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to what David said and some of the changes that we've seen in the regulatory environment before. I'm not in the political arena, and it is a bouncing ball, and I'm glad I'm not in the political arena because of that.
Good for congratulations.
Yes.
There's at least one sane person on this panel.
But what I do is I'm the one that spends the money, spends the capital, and builds infrastructure. And I believe that what's happening now is we're getting a pro-investment regulatory environment. We're seeing that trend. And it's allowing us to really go out and take an aggressive approach of reinvesting in our infrastructure, building plant and offering products and services in places where it wasn't available before, improving customer self-service. So in the past, since 2014, Charter has invested $14 billion in those areas, and we project to invest another $25 billion in the next 4 years with this new regulatory investment environment. So I think it's good. Let's hope the bouncing ball continues to bounce in our favor.
Now, let me ask you a little bit about infrastructure, because it is also a pet project of this administration, presumably, that we want to do something, not just roads and bridges, but address deficiencies in the power grid, expand broadband receptibility, if you will, to areas previously not served. Is this largely going to be, however, a private sector effort, given that it doesn't seem like the timetable, at least at the moment, for the federal government to be involved is going to be as accelerated as we might have thought just a few short months ago?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's a couple different avenues. There's one is, what do you do with existing infrastructure to do things like increase the bandwidth, increase the speed of the internet, and then there's the providing service to areas that are underserved. And providing the service to areas that are underserved is challenging. I think it's going to be a multi-pronged technology, government will probably have a role in that and subsidizing perhaps. You know, one of the challenges that we've encountered, you know, we have this little commitment in New York State to build 145,000 addresses that do not have service available today. And the big challenge is getting on the poles. And so if you think about it, to build to areas that are maybe 7, 8 homes a mile, and to do that in 3 years, that's a lot of pole attachments. And so to get the make-ready done, to process all that, and the willingness of the pole owners to process that in a timely fashion is really interesting. And you know, those are the challenges that we have, and I think we'll learn from that, not just Charter, but as an industry, you know, what it takes to go out and serve rural America, and the hurdles that you have to overcome, and how we can work together to solve those issues.
Yeah, David.
So if I can, Ron, I want to pull the camera back a little bit. So this is a personal bias of mine, but whenever anyone asks a broadband infrastructure question, I feel compelled to set what I think is an indisputably accurate record, which is that everyone up here, everyone in this audience believes that every American should be connected to the internet at home and have affordable, workable internet, even though I learned this morning that you don't. And you hardly live in rural America. I mean,
I live one block from CNBC.
Right. I mean, but
I can't even attach to their network.
But without workable broadband in your home, workable for your needs. And so there are roughly, depending on what numbers you look at, call it 25 to 30% of Americans who don't have internet at their home in their home today. But I start with the proposition that of those, 1/4 of them live in rural America, and they don't have broadband built out to their home.
Right.
3/4 of them live in urban and suburban America. They have broadband built out to their home, and they do not adopt broadband. And so, you know, we've got the 2 cable companies here are primarily urban clustered cable companies. We've built out 99, 100% of our footprint for broadband. So we've sort of done our job. And the broadband adoption problem is complicated, but it is different than the broadband deployment problem. With all the noise you're hearing around broadband in Washington today, you would think that it's all about rural America and all about deployment, but there are 3 times as many Americans who don't have internet in their homes, even though broadband's already built out in front of their homes, as there are Americans who live in rural America. So for all of us, we have to figure out a way to solve both of those problems, but let's not lose track of the broadband adoption population, which is so much more voluminous than the broadband deployment population. Now, on the deployment side, when you talk about government role, and your question was, well, you know, is that going to be private sector or government? Let's understand the United States, broadband deployment has been almost all private sector. The private sector has invested $1.5 trillion in broadband deployment since 1996 in America. That is twice the per capita spend as the private sector has put forth in Europe for broadband deployment. So I don't think it should be a headline that the solution to the broadband deployment problem is primarily going to be a private sector problem. A private sector responsibility, a private sector solution. And Tom, I'm sure you were using the word a little loosely, but you sort of hit a raw nerve for me. I think, you're not going to disagree with what I said. One of the problems with federal government and some state government expenditures on broadband deployment is a willingness to spend those dollars on underserved areas as opposed to unserved areas. And I think that was a fatal flaw, one of many, of Obama administration telecommunications policies. If you look at the BTOP program, where there was $6 billion expended for broadband deployment, give or take, hard to figure out what actually happened since there's been no very good accounting of that. But the vast majority of those dollars went to underserved areas as opposed to unserved areas because it's cheaper, it's easier to do underserved areas, but when you go to an underserved area, almost by definition, you do not connect any new people to the internet.
Yeah.
So I think one of the fundamental propositions of a federal broadband infrastructure program should be to limit dollars to unserved areas, not underserved areas. And I've also advocated for this audience that looking at what the states have been able to do, like the state of Massachusetts, as an example, which is a very interesting program, sort of copying from the states, partnering with the states, as well as partnering with the private sector, is the only way to efficiently drive additional broadband deployment in America.
So, Michael, let me follow up. David mentioned President Obama. You can go back to Al Gore talking about universal access with respect to, at the time, then internet, now more appropriately broadband. And there was this notion that somehow everyone needed to be, must be connected and must have equal opportunity, if you will, of access. Is there some element of that that still exists, or is it just, as David said, a slightly more bifurcated view than we've had over the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can go back to Theodore Vail, head of AT&T in 1919. The concept of universal service was coined at the early part of the century as a commitment to two things, ubiquity and affordability. Yeah. And that has been deeply entwined in communication public policy for over 100 years. And that is an issue that stands on firm bipartisan ground. I've never seen a Republican FCC chairman or a Democrat FCC chairman ever shrink from the importance of that investment. The FCC spends $30 billion on rural America and broadband. So I think it's a deeply rooted value. So it's pretty common that when someone starts having an infrastructure conversation, there's always going to be a communication component to it, and there's always going to be this discussion of rural. But I'd like to emphasize a couple things, and David hit on a few of them. The problem is much more subtle and complex than it's often accepted. We've tried to solve this problem many times. I would point out that 2 to 4% of Americans also still don't have indoor plumbing. 2 to 3% of Americans still do not have electricity. The last 3% in a country that's 90% rural is super hard and uneconomical. And it's not a quick fix, because it's not just a one-time construction project. It's the massive capital required to maintain that infrastructure with a pretty small revenue base over an infinite amount of time. So the government always wants to come up with a quick couple of checks, and then that's not really a long-lasting solution. The other subtlety, which David was really onto, is this adoption problem. When you take, often these communities are also people with limited disposable income. And I'll tell you what's partly happened is you have to have a computer to feel compelled to buy fixed broadband. And what's happened more and more is there's an indispensable device that all families are going to buy first. And they're going to buy a cell phone. They're going to buy an iPhone. They're going to have a family plan with all 5 of their kids on that iPhone first. And that's going to cost that family several $100s on a monthly basis.
$350.
Yes, there you go. And that device provides
We'll get to the Insana kids, David, as we do every year. Yeah.
What would a NEcta conference be without a significant Insana family story or two?
Absolutely true.
And the thing is, and that device provides a lot of very valuable internet access. The irony of the government never considering wireless a competitive substitute is really a false description. Customers make that substitution all day. I check weather on my phone. I do other internet activities primarily on my phone. So that's one of the things we're up against.
But you check stock prices on CNBC.
Absolutely.
Okay, just to be clear.
On your app.
Thank you.
The other thing I think is really important is when the government talks about $1 trillion of infrastructure development, we should understand that if you take the 3 or 4 critical infrastructures in America, 3 of them are in complete and utter disarray. The American Society of Engineers will give our grid a D-. They will give our road and transportation system a terrible rating. Bridges are collapsing across the country. Water and sewage systems built in the 1800s are cracking and can't be fixed. Broadband is the brightest infrastructure example in that whole list. The one that's been lightly regulated, the one that's attracted over $1.5 trillion in capital. So, when everybody starts competing for what that $1 trillion does, I would argue for the country's priorities, the others will take the lion's share.
And it's interesting, Tom, what Michael brings up, because when you talk about the customer experience, when you compare broadband to roads and bridges, and I've blown 5 tires in the last 6 months in New Jersey and in Manhattan, that's a horrible experience. And there's kind of no clear solution for that. And yet my cell phone, my computer notwithstanding, Dave mentioned earlier, my cell phone works on a nonstop basis. And yet the industry, it seems, hasn't necessarily made that point very clear to the public. When we talk about the consumer experience, it is vastly different to look at Flint's water, New York roads, the Tappan Zee Bridge, which is built on wooden pylons and is now being replaced for fear of it actually falling over. We have a rather...
In the Cuomo Bridge.
In the Cuomo Bridge, yes. I'm sorry, I apologize. I was politically correct to make sure we don't get
Versus
in
the
zoning.
Chris Christie Bridge.
Well, that's a different bridge. Yeah, that was a... that was a 6-hour wait, as I recall. But I'm not sure that we've, as an industry, done a very good job at making those comparisons that Michael brought up. What do you think, Tom?
I couldn't agree more. I think, look, if you look at our product, it does all the things you say. Our products, you turn it on, it works. I think it's reasonably priced. We do have some legacy baggage as an industry that we're slowly coming by interaction. You don't do it overnight, so you do it one customer at a time. So we're heading in the right direction as an industry. I don't know how you change that perception overnight, though. It's something that consumers have lived through a life cycle of our industry, good and bad, and here we are. They want our product. They want it to be fairly priced. It does work really well. They don't like the fact that we send a bill every month, but that's understandable. But that's our business model, and I think we have to, as an industry, understand that it's really on the increment that we're going to change public perception by having a high-value product, priced right, that works all the time, and we take every customer interaction and do it exceptionally well. And I think if we do that, one by one, we're going to change this perception, and it's going to trickle down to J.D. Powers and all those things, but it's going to take time.
I think, I totally agree with both Michael and Tom and with the premise of your question, which is, as an industry, we face a pretty big messaging problem. And let's give Michael credit, even though you stumbled with a little bit, which means we still have more work to do. Michael led the change of the name of NCTA, because our industry is not primarily a cable and telecommunications industry. It is primarily an internet industry. And one of the major reasons around the name change and the brand change was to begin to help lead an effort to have people think about our industry and our companies as providing internet service first and foremost before cable television, before traditional cable television services. So I think, but Tom is also right. We have 50 years of legacy thought processes to overcome, and the mind shift toward our industry is providing this incredibly important and essential internet service, and something that customers value. I mean, I joke, notwithstanding Michael's analogies about electricity and water and indoor plumbing, I actually think people would rather give up water in their houses than their internet service. They can't give up electricity because then their internet service doesn't work. So it might be tied with that. So we have to take advantage of that. And it's interesting. There are intersections between this topic. I mean, one of our problems is these public policy battles that we face are constantly undermining our attempt to be able to tell our story to the consumer. So when we go through months of battles about net neutrality, my opinion, the ultimate red herring issue of our time.
Why do you say that?
Because net neutrality hasn't been a problem forever. I mean, I hate to say this, but because I'm not allowed to say it anymore, but when we used to say that net neutrality was a solution in search of a problem, that was fundamentally accurate. And now it's a red herring issue because everyone agrees there should be net neutrality rules. And we're now down to arguing what's the best way to put those rules in place. And the industry has raised our hands and said, let's have Congress legislate them. This authority fight that we've had for the last 8 years is not a constitutional authority fight, it's a statutory authority fight. Does the Telecom Act give the FCC the authority to do what it's doing? So rather than continuing to play judicial and regulatory ping pong, the simplest solution here is to have Congress step up and to say, here are the rules of the road. Yeah. Here's your clear authority. And Chuck Schumer is a friend of mine, but it offends me when he stands up and says, doesn't matter what Ajit Pai and the FCC does, we're not going to legislate because we're going to go to court. So we're going to have another 3 or 4 years of judicial battles over something that is so easy to fix through bipartisan congressional legislation. But that fight hurts us in getting our message out about internet and the importance of internet, and that we as an industry are providing this incredibly important service that people love because it gets muddied by the noise about what we might try and do, which is all hypothetical and something that no company has ever done in terms of blocking, throttling.
Yeah. But Michael, let me ask you that question. I mean, so that messaging problem exists, right? I mean, some of us, and probably incorrectly so, when we look at rates of speed and things like that, think we're getting throttled at home. And so the aspect of messaging from the industry's perspective and now the FCC's perspective is, no, that's not happening, and yet people feel that these differing speeds of service that you get at one time of day or another, or whether or not in your area, Netflix is coming in, buffering for 5 minutes, that's actually being done on purpose as opposed to being some other technological problem as opposed to a business problem that undermines the customer's experience.
Yeah, a couple quick points. One is it's a perfect example of when you lack a good reservoir of goodwill around experiences, false stories more easily get accepted because that hypothetical somehow resonates with your impression of that class of providers. That provides really fertile ground for, I hate to use the term of the day, fake news and really fabricated examples. So yesterday you saw a lot of the internet companies putting up these things talking about, we're going to slow your experience so that you will see spinning wheels and slow loading web pages. I even saw a US senator say, this will probably lead to going back to dial-up. Now,
can't wait.
This industry has increased speeds 1,500% over a decade. It is every single company in this industry has announced a path to gigabit or 2 gigabit speeds over the course of the next several years. There's nothing factually consistent with that investment and that portrait. The other thing I think that's happening is the tech industry has become extraordinarily powerful and dominant and rich. And I think to their detriment, ultimately, they have adopted a playbook of trying to use the regulatory process to handicap others while leaving themselves free from those same restrictions. So I wrote an op-ed about this yesterday. What's amazing about this day of net neutrality, if you really are worried about neutral behavior, right, the FCC maybe has come up with 2 to 3 remotely colorable examples of an ISP doing any one of these things over the course of 20 years and a quadrillion bits. Yesterday, Twitter blocked AT&T's public policy blog because it was inconsistent with the day of action. There's nothing transparent or non-neutral about the Facebook internet news feed. There is nothing neutral about Google's search results, which you have to pay to be in the fast lane on. Yes. The internet is filled with this non-neutral behavior in which consumers have absolutely no control over the massive amount of personally collected data that then is used to make monetary choices about what they see and don't see. And yet, We're the greatest threat.
By the edge providers.
By-
I just
by-
wanna add-
yes,
I just
by
wanna
the
make
edge
sure you're
providers.
making that clear.
But Tom, I mean, so with getting to the customer experience, though, I mean, you're sitting there, middle of the day, and the damn color wheel comes up, and you're screaming at your computer, which I don't know what inanimate object I used to scream at in another technological era, but I mean, you're sitting there and you're thinking, all right, somebody is doing this to me. This is not a function of something else. I mean, and that, again, the messaging is the problem. The color wheel comes up and you think, oh, they're throttling me because they got something else going on.
So three things there. First of all, as Michael indicated, we as an industry have continued to increase our speeds. So at Charter, our minimum speed in half of our footprint is 60 meg. So you have 60 meg speed, you're pretty much going to be assured a good experience if everything else is working well. The other half is 100 meg. So we start there. And as an industry, I think everybody's doing that. The second is people now don't connect devices with a wire in the home. They connect their devices through Wi-Fi. Now, Wi-Fi today comes from a Wi-Fi device that customers buy. And I know from experience talking to customers, when somebody buys a Wi-Fi device for 40 or 50 bucks 6 years ago that was really designed for 2 meg, and we're now offering 60 meg as a minimum, they're seeing contention that shouldn't be there. And who are they going to blame? And then we tell them, well, it's really your customer-owned Wi-Fi device. And they say, well, I'm not buying another one. You need to fix it. And so we have those issues. And I think as an industry, we're going to have to figure out how do we own that space, that wireless space in the home. The third component is whoever you're accessing on the internet and their server capacity. So if their server capacity is not capable for the throughput of the multitude of connections they have, it's going to slow down. But who's the consumer going to call up and blame? It's going to be us. And so those three things come to mind, and those are the things that we deal with every day. And regulators get those complaints, and who do they think is the root cause of the problem? And so those are the things that come to mind. But I think it starts with us, and first of all, we need to have a minimum speed that's going to handle everything. We need to figure out how to own this wireless space and make it an experience that's going to work every time like we want it to. I don't know. I'll let the regulatory experts figure out how we get there. But if consumers own those devices, we're going to continue to have the problem. And I'm not sure I know how to solve that.
Now, David, I know Comcast and Charter are doing some wireless work together. How does the traditional cable industry come to own the wireless space? Because it's not like it's open field. There are other large competitors there.
And it's interesting, unlike the edge companies, I really like the way Michael talked about this, Charter and Comcast are not trying to dominate the wireless space. We're trying to enter the field seamlessly and efficiently to provide a service to our customers that we think our customers have. We have no aspiration to be a big four wireless company, either Charter or Comcast or together. But what we're trying to build on is what Tom talked about. We've got this incredible Wi-Fi network in the home, outside the home. We also have a collaboration across the cable industry where in Newport, if there's Charter Wi-Fi, I can connect to it as a Comcast customer because we're collaborating with each other. So in New York, I now have, I guess, Spectrum Wi-Fi that I can connect to. Cable Wi-Fi is what it's branded outside of each of our home territories. So we've got this incredible Wi-Fi network that we've invested in and that we've built, and we now want to complement that with a cellular wireless network. So this is my Xfinity mobile phone, and when I am within reach of an Xfinity or cable Wi-Fi, actually now it's only Xfinity, but ultimately it will be cable Wi-Fi hotspot, it will automatically connect to that hotspot. I won't be using my cellular data, I'll be using my Wi-Fi for that data instead. When I am not within reach of a Wi-Fi hotspot, it's using the cellular network. So it's an example of how we're trying to provide a service to our customers that is valuable to them, which hopefully will improve, it's part of this long process that hopefully will improve customer appreciation and customer satisfaction for our end-to-end services.
Now, Tom, before I go on, do you have a product you would like to show in the interest of fairness?
They'll have this soon.
I'll pass on that one.
So, Michael, we were talking earlier before.
I didn't bring an X1 box.
That's fair enough.
What a big truck that's
Yeah,
out front.
There is a truck out front.
Be
Yeah,
careful, it could drive right through those doors if we're not careful.
We have seen now a proliferation of services, and we were talking before we started this conversation about things like Alexa, which obviously operates off a Wi-Fi network. And if your Wi-Fi's down, Alexa does not deliver service. So we're piggybacking now over broadband, over Wi-Fi. The customer experience is getting more and more intense on a daily basis. I mean, we're talking about the Internet of Things, we're talking about in-home communication devices that talk to one another. And we've been talking about this actually for quite a number of years, but we're getting incrementally closer, if not, in some cases, closer at a much more rapid rate. So what does that mean to the customer experience? It's still based on the backbone, even though we have all this new stuff coming in the house, right?
Yeah. Three things. You know, I think what has always been ultimately going to happen is that with the increasing miniaturization of microprocessors, the increasing power of networks, technologies we're going to start to embed in the human scale, right? We've gone from a device that filled a room called a computer to one that sits on a desk, to one that sits in your lap, to one that sits in your palm. We are starting now to weave technological functionality into our everyday lives in ways that act more like our senses act and not like the artificial act of inputting and outtaking. So I think there's going to be this growing seamlessness in the human experience around technology that we'll have to support. The second point that I think is really important, goes to what David was talking about, is we are a major wireless provider. I mean, one of the great things that I get frustrated with the way we talk about networks is if they are completely separated and not integrated. The cable network has probably more wireless devices hanging off of it than Verizon's network has hanging off of it. We're not getting, I don't think these guys are getting into wireless, they're getting into more mobility. You know, the wireless industry would not thrive without the cable fixed infrastructure or wires to help take that congestion, put it in the ground and move it. So those things have to grow in a symbiotic way. Third, I think the greatest threat to everything we are talking about is the rise of the cyber threat. We have raced as a society, giddy, drunk, and excited about our toys. And we've traded...
Yeah, but we were doing that before cable.
Yes,
so,
we
yeah.
were. We were just drunk then.
Yes.
But I think we as a society have highly valued convenience over security. We have engineered email, we have engineered Internet of Things devices, we have engineered a lot of things in a way that security was an afterthought. And at the same time, we've invited the American and global consumer to put more and more of their lives into this space, which means the risk profile of the consequences are getting higher and the vulnerabilities are increasing. And we've seen the ransomware, we've seen the Russian hacks, we've seen, you know, this is going to be a daily part of our diet. And I think that there's not a non-trivial risk that could get melted down.
I think I think that's an unbelievably important point. And to build off of something that Tom said earlier, when there are mini or mega breaches of security, most of which will be tied to the millions of devices that are hanging off of our network, just like when there's a problem with server capacity or your hardware, you are not going to call the manufacturer of your device, you're going to call your cable company.
Yeah, that's right.
My security has been breached, my identity has been stolen, and it's your fault. You have to fix it. And so I think it is one of the greatest threats to what I think is a slowly improving customer experience and a slowly improving perception of the value being delivered by our industry, that the risks that Michael identified are, I think, one of the biggest threats to moving backwards, and moving backwards in a dramatic fashion.
So Tom, though, in the absence of really a single entity with which a consumer can communicate, it is by default your cable or your wireless operator that you're going to go to, because you're like, look, this is your network. This is where I just got, pinched. There is no authority to go to if there's a cyber breach, except for either the bank where you had a mistake, or if it's a data delivery system, cable company, right?
Yes. The answer is yes. And to the points made, this is another opportunity for us as an industry. We can own this space of cybersecurity. I think we're the best position to own it. We can do work that nobody else can because of our infrastructure. And if you talk to engineers that do this every day, there's a larger percentage of internet traffic that we throw away that doesn't belong there through our filtering mechanisms than what we pass through. So think about that. That's a lot of wasted traffic on this internet pipe that gets thrown away because it shouldn't be there. And it's amazing if you sit and talk to the people that do this every day, all the junk that's there, whether it be spam email traffic or hackers trying to do DDoS attacks, whatever it is, it's a ton of activity that doesn't belong there. And we're actually doing a phenomenal job today as an industry making that traffic invisible to the consumer. And I think it's an opportunity for us as an industry to own that space and really hold our sign up that says, we're going to protect you, Mr. and Mrs. Consumer.
Michael, before I go to kind of a quick lightning round at the end here, when we were talking before we came up, the power grid's vulnerability, right, which is greater than broadband vulnerability. There's some people who believe that Russia would rather take out our power grid than fire a missile at us these days, because it would render us just as inoperable if the grid were to be attacked. How much work do we have to do on the electricity grid to support the stability and safety of everything else that we're talking about today, as opposed to really focusing on cybersecurity from the perspective of the cable and wireless industry?
Well, I'm no expert, but from what I've studied, it's extremely dangerous. And it's a major complex, I would say, urgent red alarm problem. This country, sometimes you benefit from having been a leader. This country was the world's leader in electric grid deployment in the history of the world. It was the leader in getting infrastructure to a massive geography and demography. And we did it with 1800s, 1900s basic infrastructure. And as those things became computerized, this was the furthest thing from anyone's mind. And we now have two classes of actors, one state actors, Russia, China, North Korea, and the criminal element, largely Russian and Eastern European, who have become so sophisticated at finding those vulnerabilities. I think for a quick example that should inform what you say is the Sony attack by North Korea.
Yeah.
An angry, petulant state, right, in a quick afternoon, almost destroyed the infrastructure of an entire business, right? And they're still reeling from it. I think that's peanuts to what you could do if you wanted to turn off New York. I think it's widely believed the Chinese could turn off North Korea if they had to. I have a feeling we could turn off countries if we wanted to. But if we're not committed as public leaders to hardening that infrastructure over time, I think the security and safety of our citizens are put at risk.
All right, I'm going to do three quick questions as we come down. We just to talk more broadly about the end user experience. We have seen, Tom, a proliferation, as we said earlier, of devices, opportunities, whether it's Alexa, whether it's Netflix, Hulu, all the content that is coming along with faster service, better service, more reliable service. In the next 12 months, what should we expect to see? There is obvious consolidation going on. There's partnerships taking place. There's a lot happening at a pretty rapid pace right now. 12 months from now, what will the consumer notice most about the experience at home?
Wow. I mean, there's not enough time here, but I think
You have 15 seconds.
15 seconds? All right. And I'm going to talk about customer self-service. I think it's an area that companies like Comcast and Charter are really investing a lot in. So, you know, as great as our technicians are that go to the home, and as nice as our people are that are on the phones that we answer, consumers today want to go to a site on the internet, look at the products and services we have to offer, be able to identify the packaging and pricing that fits their needs, and click a button and expect, hopefully, a shipment to come either, you know, UPS or FedEx within a day or two, and hook
Amazon.
those devices up, plug and play, and I'm off and running, including a great wireless Wi-Fi router that comes with that. So I think that's a real opportunity for us. Customer self-service, and I can go on and on all the things that come under that umbrella, because consumers, you know, like to do that today, especially, you know, the next generation. You know, my kids, they don't want to have to call and talk to anybody. They want to do everything online. They'd rather not interact with a human and go to the internet.
I'm familiar with that, yeah.
Yes.
I consider myself human and realize that my kids don't want to interact
Yes,
with me.
yes, I have the same issue.
Although I should point out, and David, a quick Insana Kid update,
Right.
because we are now affiliated with Snap. My oldest daughter, who I think I update every year on the
Yes,
number of
yep.
Snapchats sent or received as of this
That
morning.
horrifying number.
It is a
every year,
horrifying
yes.
number. 315,000 Snapchats over a 5-year period sent or received. That is 144 per day. Same facial expression, tongue out to the left, tongue out to the right, duck face, that's it, with some caption.
And this justified a $500 million investment in that company.
Yes,
Ron's daughter is incredibly powerful.
she's an influencer, to use the word. Michael, from your perspective, the next 12 months.
So I'll let these guys talk about the cable experience, but I think what you're going to see is an increasing humanization of technology through machine learning and artificial intelligence. The speed, the technological speed curve of the degree to which machines are learning to learn is breathtaking.
Yeah.
And I think consumers are going to start to have this expectation of their devices and their technology learning and reacting to change and evolution. And I think the other big thing I see a lot of people work on is what I would call instantaneity, meaning got to have it instantly now. Amazon's doing everything possible that you get it within 5 minutes of you ordering it. Google's doing everything possible to make answers come back instantaneously. I think the speed time dimension are going to become even more breathtaking.
We talked about this already. I tested Alexa in that regard to see just how creative their engineers were. And I asked Alexa if she found me attractive. Response was, as you know, I don't have eyes, but if I did, I might. That's how far we've come.
She will
she also
next
has
year.
she might next year, yeah. My wife doesn't even give me that answer.
But remember, when you discuss that subject with your wife and kids, Alexa's listening.
Yes, well, we know, but that's another, we don't have time for that conversation. Content perspective, David, since we split the difference in our business to a certain extent in that regard, what should we expect to see?
So I think I think you're going to, I think in the NBC Universal world, I think we are working very hard on trying to understand the digital world. I mean, obviously, we're having a lot of success in traditional delivery of content, whether it is film or broadcast television or cable television. But we're spending a lot of effort trying to understand the digital world and how we can deliver our content in the digital world. So partnership to keep your eyes on over the next 12 months is the NBC Universal Snap partnership for the Olympics. Because Snapchat is not exactly geared traditionally for Olympic content, but we have a partnership. We're going
Well,
to
100-yard dash is less than 30 seconds. So.
Right, but they don't have that in the Winter Olympics, the last
Correct,
I checked.
yes.
But it'll be, and we don't really know how to convert longer form sports content to a millennial digital service like Snapchat, and that's why we're going to experiment with it and we have this partnership, it'll be very interesting. So that's, I mean, I think that's what we're trying to pay attention to. Not that we're going to get out of the film business or the broadcast television or cable television business, but how do we take this treasure trove of content that we produce, high quality content, and figure out how to present that content in a digital form, in smaller bites, to be able to continue to allow that content ecosystem to grow.
And your next multi-billion-dollar acquisition is?
I always want to do that at this conference.
I know. Yeah. David Cohen, thank you very much. Michael Powell, Tom Adams, thank you. Thank you for your attention. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. We'll see you again at NEcta 2018.